Some time ago I made a video on Hard Drivin for the Mega Drive, although it was mostly 25 minutes of me explaining how regular console graphics in games which aren't Hard Drivin work. So I could then explain how Hard Drivin's graphics work to an audience who, by that point, would be able to understand why they're so unusual and clever. Unless said audience used the chapter skip button to go straight to the bit which is about Hard Drivin, which, according to my analytics, was just about all of you. Well, one thing which did come out of that video was people telling me about their experiences with other, even more implausible versions of Hard Drivin, which made me think. It'd be nice to visit a few of them, and maybe see if I can also figure out how they might have worked. See, Hard Drivin is almost Lemmings-like, in terms of the number of different platforms it's been ported to. This might not be immediately obvious from your favourite online games database, as some systems got Hard Drivin, some systems only got the sequel, Race Drivin, and some also got a special home-only version called Hard Drivin 2, Drive Harder. First I need to set a record straight, and not this severely warped and damaged Everly Brothers 45. A shame. A couple of good tracks on there. Hard Drivin is often touted as the game which brought polygon driving to the masses, including, on occasion, by me. And this is not on the whole untrue. For most of us bordering the Atlantic Ocean, the first polygon racer we'd have seen in an arcade would have been this or Virtua Racing, and in some of the more slower moving arcades it hung around for a long time. I remember seeing it at Land's End in the very late 90s. But polygon racing began with the Namco System 21 and a game called Winning Run. It was, as they used to say in certain musical circles, big in Japan. In addition to the pioneering hardware, called Polygonizer at this point, it included a motion platform to make racing more exciting. While technically interesting, it's not a great game, and I'm not very great at it. Driving physics are minimal, the AI cars have no collision avoidance, and you stop if they hit you. And in between, those frame rate drops are painful. It's worth mentioning, given all the talk about frame rates on the home versions, that even these arcade originals tried to push a bit more than the hardware can handle. This isn't an emulation quirk either. They were genuinely like this at the time. It wasn't until Virtua Racing and then Daytona USA that rock-solid 3D frame rates became the arcade racing game norm. But why am I showing you this game if it's neither Hard Drivin nor Great Drivin? Well, this board and the Hard Drivin board share the same roots, diverging after Atari and Namco separated while both were still in development. They both work in a similar way to a modern PC, although with a different hardware approach in each. Up until the 90s, PCs drew graphics by getting the CPU to write data into graphics RAM, pixel by pixel, or bitplane by bitplane, if you want to be accurate about 16-colour EGA and VGA modes. But as graphical operating systems like Windows became more popular, the number of writes required to draw a high-resolution display became painfully slow on the limited memory bandwidth and slow CPUs of the day. Since drawing windows tended to use the same line, clip and fill commands, why not have a graphics card which could fill a line of pixels by itself, rather than have the CPU do it? This meant just one instruction, and the CPU could get on with its day, speeding up everything, and not just drawing. Such a card was a Windows accelerator, a popular upgrade in the early 90s. Toward the end of the decade, these Windows accelerator boards started to be supplanted by 3D accelerator boards. Instead of operations useful only for dull business applications, they had exciting and fun operations, related to drawing and texturing transformed polygons. In 1999, Nvidia released the GeForce 256, a card which could not only draw the polygons, but also do the transformation and lighting calculations itself. PC was now the equal of any console or arcade hardware, and the path was set to today's RGB-lit but rather more homogeneous hardware world, where everything is more or less a PC, underneath the fancy industrial design. Yes, even arcade cabinets. But 3D accelerators were not a new idea when they hit the PC in the late 90s. The only difference was that they had become affordable for the home market. Professional graphics workstations had been offloading their 3D calculations to dedicated chips for years. Initially DSP chips, which performed multiplication and transform operations, then dedicated GPUs, targeted specifically toward graphics operations. Having said this, Namco's Polygonizer/System 21 still looked a lot more like an arcade board than anything you'd find in a beige tower unit. They followed typical arcade practice of having two relatively low-powered CPUs, a 12MHz Motorola 68000 in this case, and offloading the graphics and sound to custom chips, of which the System 21 has a huge number, because it doesn't use a GPU. It uses 5 Texas Instruments DSPs to perform all those polygon-related calculations. Which is a good point to move to Hard Drivin, because that is much more PC-like. It has a relatively strong CPU for the time, a single Motorola 68010. It has a Texas Instruments GPU to render polygons. It has another Texas Instruments chip to scale up the pixels output. And then it has yet another Texas Instruments GPU to run physics calculations. Because much like today's GPUs, those early workstation GPUs were as much general-purpose floating-point hardware as they were specifically graphics-focused chips, part of what made accelerator boards far too expensive for the consumer market. Plus, of course, a sound card. We're already quite a long way into this video, and I've barely got as far as 2 games, one of which isn't even part of the Hard Drivin series, so all the information you're getting here is sound card, boolean variable, equals true. Follow-up, Race Drivin, used much the same hardware, but with a supplementary DSP board allowing for more floating point calculations to happen per frame, which seems as good a time as any to extend the amount of time I can show you Race Drivin for by talking about the physics. Hard Drivin's cars are, internally, more like weird motorbikes. To simplify the physics enough to fit in hardware constraints, it simulates each axle as a single wheel. Given this came out in an era where most arcade racing games were super scalar types with barely any more physics than required to make a car go left when you turn the wheel left, and have a maximum speed corners can be taken at, this is what I'd call solidly more than good enough. Race Drivin took advantage of its extra board to simulate 4 wheels. Whether this was appreciated, I don't know. Contemporary reviews seem more concerned with the somewhat limited nature of the add-on tracks than the detailed nuances of how the car handles. But for me, even playing on something which is definitely not the original cabinet or hardware, it's clear that this was quite something for the turn of the 1990s. That extra 2 wheels worth of simulation fidelity lifts it to the point where I feel like I can do things I'd do in an actual car, and the game will respond with a crude but still definitely close enough approximation of what would actually happen. It's worth remembering that it would take another 8 years before Grand Prix Legends came along and rewrote the rulebook on what we could expect from simulation fidelity. Well, 7 years before Gripped Soda Off-Road Racing rewrote that rulebook. I did a video about that. Hard and/or Race Drivin were also intended to have 2 sequels, Street Drivin, which added a police car to the by now established format, and Hard Drivin's Airborne, a gloriously mad idea where you could press a button to sprout wings on some of the larger jumps. Sadly, it never saw widespread release. Perhaps it was just too complicated for a pick-up-and-play arcade game. So now we know the arcade and how it works, let's look at some more home versions. The PC, Amiga and Atari versions of Hard Drivin may seem rather familiar if you happen to have seen my video on the Mega Drive version. Except of course they're not having to do crazy things with the video hardware to render polygons. Choosing one of these vintage machines to run it on is a little bit choose your poison, in that all the versions are compromised in some way. The PC version offers nice frame rates. A but only has PC speaker sound. Whereas on the A500 or ST, things sound nice, but run a bit choppily, and it's not happy about being asked to run on a faster Amiga. Plus those famous physics have been toned down quite a bit to run on hardware that doesn't feature a fancy DSP chip. It's still good for a home computer racing game of the era, but the liveliness and feeling of having a car you can slide around is replaced by a more mundane car that understeers off the track if you get too ambitious with entry speed into a corner. One oddity is that with wheel controllers not really existing back then, and even analog joysticks being relatively few and far between, the game simulates a steering wheel using the mouse. This wasn't totally unusual. Car and Driver offers the same as one of its mini steering options, but it does take a bit of getting used to, and was, as I recall, a lot less fun when using a cheap ball mouse. Of course, the longevity of the game is a problem when you consider that Amiga, ST and PC games were typically not rented. They were bought, and expected to last more than a weekend. Which brings me to a home version only oddity in the Hard Drivin series. One of the best ways to extend the longevity of a game in this era was to include a track editor. It's why I have many fond memories of the otherwise not particularly good Grand Prix Unlimited. Having friends round, each building a track, then challenging the other to finish it. Good times. Which is exactly what Hard Drivin 2 Drive Harder includes. Not necessarily good times, but a pernickety, fiddly and often willfully obtuse track editor, which nevertheless eventually allows you to build your own tracks. If you are willing to suffer a painful fight working out exactly what combination of curves will make the two ends meet up again. It's like Scalex trick, but annoying. There's a reason it's 4D sports driving, aka stunts, that everyone remembers as the one with the track editor. But overall, while it may be missing the forgotten track editor, it's Race Drivin that is probably the best of the contemporary home conversions. Yes, there's a reason I'm adding the word contemporary, and it's not just to give me enough time to show this footage. I'll get to that later, but these home computer versions are particularly nice, since the PC port finally adds sound card support, and both PC and Amiga version have timing routines which support fast CPUs, meaning you finally banish all those Mega Drive frame rate woes. Unless, of course, you play Race Drivin on the Mega Drive. Because yes, they did port this one over to the 1970s prog rock band turned 80s pop sensation, and it uses that same wild system of abusing tiles as a frame buffer. It also includes the simple track editor. While it doesn't allow for the same complexity of courses as the one included in Hard Drivin 2, I would say this is genuinely impressive for a console that isn't even supposed to be doing this sort of game in the first place. What's maybe a bit less impressive is how they handled the large polygons of the hill for the Super Stunt course. Or rather, didn't. Because on Sega's Further 5th, the track rears into the air with no surrounding terrain, as if you're playing some alternate universe version of Stunt Car Racer, and then still has a quite ridiculous frame drop when you drive past a barn, which is now floating in the middle of the sky. What do I know? Maybe anti-gravity barns are extremely taxing for the Motorola 68000 to simulate. I'll be revisiting console versions of Race Drivin later, but before that, it's time to admit that the Mega Drive is far from the most ridiculous platform to attempt a Hard Drivin port. There's one for the ZX Spectrum. 3D on the Spectrum is an interesting idea, because Sinclair's iconic colour home computer came out in 1982, and was not exactly top-of-the-line hardware even then, being designed for affordability above all else. That's not to say people didn't try, such as the Freescape series of games which started with Driller. You'll no doubt notice two things about Driller on the Spectrum. One is that the 3D area is monochrome. The other is that it's very, very slow. Let's deal with that monochrome thing first. One of the cost-saving measures common on early 8-bit computers was to use some of the system RAM to hold the video frame buffer. This meant less memory available to the system. With early machines coming with as little as 16 kilobytes, you want to avoid using too much of it for video, lest you require some of the more wild early 80s micro hacks, such as Jeff Crammond's Revs, storing some of its data by using two identical looking shades of blue to draw the sky. That was actually a thing which happened. But on the Spectrum, there was a clever hack to reduce the amount of memory required by the graphics. The screen would be represented by a 256 by 192 bitmap. Literally a bitmap. It stores a 1-bit on or off value for each pixel. There would then be an attribute map detailing what the foreground and background colour of the screen were, divided into 8 by 8 blocks. This meant that with 8 colours to choose from, 3 bits each, and 2 flags for bright and flashing, the colour information only needed 32 by 24 cells, meaning the Spectrum could hold an entire screen of 16 colour graphics in just 7 kilobytes with a simple frame buffer, rather than requiring 24 kilobytes of memory and multiple bit planes on a computer where the base model only came with 16 kilobytes of the stuff. The downside is what happens if 2 pixels of different colour happen to share the same attribute block. Well, one colour wins, with the effect looking like the sprites are being overwritten. Something called attribute clash, or somewhat incorrectly, colour clash, a phrase Spectrum owners were used to hearing as playground mockery from owners of other, browner computers. We had an Acorn Electron. It could do all of the colours and in shades other than brown, just not very fast. Sprite-based games on the Speccy handled this problem by carefully lining up their backgrounds on those 8x8 boundaries, so attribute clash could be avoided most of the time. But in solid 3D, lines run all over the place without any consideration for such things, resulting in the classic solution: only have one foreground and one background colour for the entire playfield. This still leaves the problem of speed. Now, if you told me there was a port of Hard Drivin to the Speccy, I would have assumed it used wireframe 3D, like Elite on the BBC, and the Spectrum's own Starglider. This was the accepted way to get decent 3D performance out of something which only ran, in the Spectrum's case, a humble 3.5 MHz Z80A CPU. With wireframe 3D, you don't need to go through the expensive step of scan converting all the polygons, and then writing all of those line strips to the video memory, or in this case, system memory, because we're sharing it. Instead, you just have to work out where the vertices of each polygon are, and draw a line between them. If you get fancy, you can work out which lines would be hidden, which gives a convincing 3D effect, and still runs acceptably fast on an 8-bit micro. So, did ZX Spectrum Hard Drivin do this? No. Several decades before the word Madlad was invented, they decided to do solid polygon-filled 3D, and it works about as well as can be expected. But surprisingly, these Driller-esque frame rates are not the worst thing about ZX Spectrum Hard Drivin. Oh no. Because what you can't see here, other than perhaps infer from my wild spearing around the track, is the control method. Arcade Hard Drivin used a force feedback steering wheel, which is an excellent idea if you're building a dedicated arcade cabinet. 16-bit home computer Hard Drivin uses a mouse, which is a little weird, but kinda works. I can live with it. I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe Hard Drivin uses the joypad, with the classic approach to using digital controls for analog things, which is to effectively act like a spring. The longer you press the button, the further it moves. When you release the button, it returns to the centre. ZX Spectrum Hard Drivin gets some points for using a relatively sensible QAOP setup, and then squanders them all, and more, by having one of the worst steering mechanisms imaginable. Each press of O or P moves the virtual steering wheel left or right by a few degrees. There is no self-centering. So as a result, you spend most of your time trying to compensate for your own steering inputs, at about 1 frame per second. This is the first version where I'm going to say what people normally say about all the others I've shown. This is a terrible port. Despite this, Hard Drivin did make it to other 8-bit home computers. The Amstrad CPC version looks initially promising, including this music, which is oddly reminiscent of the Zelda 2 Palace theme. Promising, that is, unless you spot a certain little phrase in this description of the controls. Or know that the Amstrad CPC also uses a 4MHz Z80A CPU. And yes, it's this again. Maybe it runs slightly better on Alan Sugar's box of affordable dreams. That just lets you see more of how dreadful a port this is. And the C64 version, should you be wondering, is... This one was only released as part of a compilation, and there's a good reason for that. At this point you might be wondering if there's an 8-bit version that isn't based on this dire control scheme and tragic frame rate. And there are. Some rather interesting ones, in fact. The first never saw a public release, which is a shame, because it's a lot better than most of the 8-bit micro versions. In case you're wondering what this bizarre, unfinished prototype I'm running is, it's the NES version. It does something quite fascinating. And yes, it's tile map time again. When I'm driving along a normal section of road, this is a horizontal interrupt scrolling 1980s style driving game. A good design decision. The NES can do this. But when I approach a stunt, there's a mapper chip in the cartridge, which changes the tiles to ones which control the 3D object. Astonishingly, this works, and the NES can pull it off at a decent frame rate. Sadly, the game was never completed. Which means at this point you might be wondering if there's a version which did achieve the impossible, drawing genuine 3D polygons on 8-bit hardware at a decent frame rate, and without connecting it to the world's most awful control scheme. There is. And it's on a system even more implausible for one to exist than the Mega Drive. Here is Race Drivin for the Nintendo GameBoy. An 8-bit system with a sprite and tile map based graphics subsystem. It runs a Sharp SM83 at 4 MHz, a chip closely related enough to a Z80 that many parts of the internet will claim that said Z80 is what's inside. Given all these setbacks, I genuinely do not know how they managed this. The frame rate is slow, but still playable. The Super Stunt track manages to have its hill, and in a saving throw none of the 8-bit home computer versions managed, they've used the self-centering control scheme for the steering. If I had to take a guess, I'd imagine the Game Boy's limited 160 by 144 screen resolution helps. And maybe the bandwidth to video RAM is a little more generous than those early 8-bit micros, even if it is having to go via a tile map. But it's still impressive to make this run so well, on hardware similar to some truly dreadful ports. I even looked to see if there was some sort of mapper chip at play, but I'm not sure one which would help even existed for the Game Boy. So it looks like this is indeed rendering polygons straight to the tile set, using the base hardware, just like the Mega Drive version. I did discover something else though. This was programmed by Argonaut, the company of Jez San, who had programmed Starglider for the ZX Spectrum, and would go on to produce B-Render, the technology behind Microsoft Movie Maker and Carmageddon, amongst many others. And in between those, a small matter of the Super FX chip for the Super Nintendo. In other words, Argonaut were good at 3D. If anyone was going to make an 8-bit version of Hard Drivin work, it was them. There's one more 8-bit handheld version of Hard Drivin that I think is worth looking at, partly because I've played it before, and know it's not terrible, but mainly because there's something technically interesting going on that none of the other versions do. Although Atari would perhaps rather I called it a 16-bit version, because this is the Lynx port, which is serviceable. Unlike the other home versions, the car in the Lynx port seems rather keener to oversteer, and I like the little indication of steering wheel position. But if you're looking at it from a point of view of entertainment and an enjoyable experience, rather than technical intrigue, its main notable feature is being overwhelmingly average, the gaming equivalent of a contemporary Ford Orion. Unlike said Ford Orion, the Lynx is interesting from an engineering standpoint. It combines an 8-bit system on chip called Mikey with a 16-bit custom graphics processor called Suzy. Surprisingly, Atari didn't attempt to claim this as a 24-bit system, although 16-bit is still a little bit of a stretch, when the CPU part of Mikey is a low-power version of the MOS 6502, which you'd have found in an Apple II or Acorn Electron, albeit clocked rather lower than it is in the Lynx. Suzy, on the other hand, is an unusual chip to find in a 1989 console full stop, let alone a portable one. Because instead of a background layer and a limited number of sprites, it does everything with sprites, which can be stretched, tilted, and distorted. This was intended to bring some of the arcade superscalar magic to a handheld experience, and on top of that, make some of the effects developers spent ages messing with scanlines and careful timing to get working easier to do. Rather than try to distort a background layer by carefully changing the offset each scanline with all the limitations that brought, you could simply instruct the Suzy chip to do this distortion for you. A consequence of this is that you could create a sprite which was a single pixel of solid colour, which you could then instruct Suzy to scale, distort and tilt until it formed a triangle. This is where I found myself really wanting a Lynx emulator with a graphics RAM debugger, because I think this is what Lynx Hard Drivin does, and I need to verify it. Sadly, while in theory debug versions of Handy are available, I couldn't get one to run correctly on my tragically modern PCs. However, there is one thing I can try. One iconic feature of Hard Drivin is its translucent bridges and loops, achieved using a checkerboard pattern, which would have looked a lot more like perfect 50% opacity on a contemporary CRT. If Lynx Hard Drivin was using the stretching and distorting trick to produce polygons, it wouldn't be able to produce a checkerboard pattern, because the squares which make it up would also be distorted and stretched in the same way. So I should drive to the bridge and the loop, because if I'm correct, they will be solid colours. Which indeed, they are. So while I can't say for certain that Hard Drivin for the Lynx is using a clever and unusual trick to render polygons that doesn't appear on any other platform, I can say for the purposes of an entertainment video that it appears highly likely to me. All of this would be great if anybody had actually asked me to investigate these things and foist more crudely drawn diagrams on the world to explain them. In reality, the most popular reaction to my original Hard Drivin video wasn't, "You should try to work out exactly how the Lynx version was done." It was variations on, "Lol, you should play the SNES version, it's awful." So I did. Let me say that while I am prepared to defend the low expectations of vintage frame rates, there's a point below which I am not prepared to do that. One of the worst frame drops in home versions of Race Drivin is the first banked turn on the Super Stunt course. This is particularly horrific here. In one session, the rate dropped so low that the game soft-locked, unable to even calculate movement correctly. Why is this so much worse than the Mega Drive version? The answer gets dangerously close to our old favourite, blast processing. While no more powerful in terms of instructions per second, despite the higher clock rate, the 16-bit external data bus and multiplier meant the Mega Drive's Motorola 68000 CPU could perform more 16-bit fixed-point polygon calculations per second and get the results out to the video RAM far quicker than the SNES. Now I have some suitable technical explanation, I could stop here, having found yet another bad port of Hard Drivin to go with all the 8-bit home micro versions. Well, Race Drivin in this particular instance. But that wouldn't tell the whole story. Back when I covered polygons on the Mega Drive, I mentioned that SEGA had tried putting a CPU, or rather a DSP, in the cartridge. This had been the SEGA Virtua Processor. It had cost 70 quid, and we'd all agreed never to do it again. On the SNES, putting extra chips in cartridges was far more common. The NES before it had used memory mapper chips to get around the limiting cartridge port interface. And while the Super variant had no need of these, it did take the concept of putting a little bit of console in the cartridge to heart. Most famously, with the Super FX chip from our old friends at Argonaut. You may look at the way Star Fox, the first Super FX game, runs, and ask why Race Drivin didn't use this to provide a home port which could have challenged Virtua Racing for authenticity. Exceeded it, given the simpler target for emulation. Well, one simple reason is that the Super FX didn't release until 1993, and Race Drivin is a 1992 game. Even if it had been around, the Hard and Race Drivin console ports were not what we'd call AAA releases these days. They were firmly in the budget end of the market, and bunging additional CPUs inside the plastic casing would have increased costs beyond what was sustainable. That shouldn't stop anyone wondering what might have been though. And some of the people who have wondered what might have been ended up doing more about it than just make videos as a thinly disguised excuse to slowly fill up the internet with footage of them wearing a pair of cheap wolf ears. In particular, Brazilian hacker Vitor Vilea. I fear my pronunciation of that might be the whole Dino Dini thing all over again. Sorry, Vitor. Just like I've mangled the creator of Kickoff's name in multiple videos, the Super FX was not the only chip to appear in SNES cartridges. One of the more popular options was the SA1, which shoved a 10MHz 65C816 into a cartridge, along with some extra DMA options for getting data around the insides of the Super Nintendo. It appeared late in the SNES lifecycle, used mostly for Japanese market games, with Super Mario RPG being a notable exception of an SA1 game with a US release. Vitor wondered what would have happened if this chip had been around earlier, and used to enhance Contra-free, Gradius-free, Super R-Type and, of more relevance to this video, Race Drivin. So here is his version of SNES Race Drivin, which includes an SA1 enhancement chip. While it has a few rough edges from being a fan-made patch, it is genuinely a solid game. As nice as running the 16-bit home computer version on a reasonably fast PC or A1200? Of course not. But this shows what could have been possible for the game on SNES, given a little care, some slightly less budget aspirations, and an enhancement chip which wouldn't exist for another 3 years. Which is the point. The SA1 was hardly contemporary to the original games and their home ports between 89 and 92. You're talking about hardware in the mid-90s, then surely you're talking about Sony's all-conquering PlayStation. And guess what happened in Japan? Yes, there was a version of Race Drivin for the PS1, which is two things. Completely and utterly pointless, and really rather good. The original maps are recreated as is, but with none of its characteristic fixed point texture warping in play. The PS1 does look great pushing out flat shaded polygons. It also does it at a rate which puts any of the arcade versions to shame, let alone the 16-bit ports. But Time Warner were aware that 3 simple solid shaded tracks wasn't going to cut it in an era that was in thrall to the texture map. So we get a bunch of additional courses in all their wobbly PS1 glory. Finally, to close this chapter on console hard driving, it's time to go right back to where I started, a SEGA console. The augmented and remastered version also made its way to the Saturn. The Saturn didn't have quite the same level of native 3D support as its competitors, but that old tile map approach has long since been banished. This uses hardware accelerated quadrilaterals, which other than a swap to triangles for easier calculations, is pretty much what you'd do for a modern PC port. Which brings me finally to the ultimate could have been. What if Hard Drivin had seen a remastered release on modern PC hardware? One which set out not merely to recreate the original arcade game, but to go beyond it. Not in terms of adding wobbly texture map tracks, but in enhancing the physics and the car handling. Well, I don't need to ask. Because there's a custom map for everyone's favourite hardware punishingly authentic simulation of bus bending. BeamNG.drive. Driving an ordinary road car on loops and jumps goes just about as well as you'd expect. Except now it's time for me to admit one thing. While Challenge Timberwolf is the least popular part of these retro videos according to my analytics page, and I've already got a runtime that makes the end of the director's cut of Return of the King look aggressively edited, I did still challenge myself to complete a lap, in the closest thing I could find to my own real-life car. Makes damaging it feel that little more high stakes, you know? And it is possible, in BeamNG.drive, a realistic simulator with a famously real-world damage model, to complete a lap of the stunt course with a car vaguely like one that exists in the real world, with plausible real-world values for suspension geometry, stiffness, power, grip, and perhaps most importantly for this scenario, exactly the same susceptibility to bent chassis components, broken sumps, damaged radiators and destroyed bodywork. A car that has had to go through distinctly implausible jumps, loops and extreme cornering situations. And yet despite all this, it ends the lap mostly intact. Well, mostly. Oh, that bumper will buff out.
Which raises the possibility for perhaps the ultimate version of Hard Drivin. Forget trying to cram polygons into 16-bit hardware and build that stunt course for real.